How did Comanche warriors sleep through freezing nights outdoors? 35 to 40-minute retention-optimized YouTube documentary script. In the winter of 1874, United States cavalrymen entered the Texas Panhandle believing they were hunting exhausted Comanche bands. Then the north wind arrived. The temperature fell. The open plateau offered no wall, no forest, and almost no protection. Army canvas snapped in the wind. Water began to freeze. Men wearing clothing chosen for a different season discovered that a military uniform could not stop the plains from pulling heat out of their bodies. But somewhere beyond their reach, Comanche families were sleeping, not standing beside enormous fires all night, not shivering in the open through some superhuman act of endurance. They were resting inside portable homes, protected by a system so efficient that people could wake before sunrise, saddle their horses, and move again while their pursuers were still fighting the cold. How? The answer was not one invention. It was 6 layers of protection, and each layer solved a different way the cold can kill you. 1 blocked the wind. 1 controlled the air inside the shelter. 1 stopped frozen ground from stealing body heat. 1 stored warmth after the flames went down. 1 fueled the human body from within. And the final layer allowed the entire system to move hundreds of miles. Remove 1 layer, and the others might save you. Remove 2, and the night became dangerous. Remove all 6 at once, and even the most experienced people on the plains could be broken before winter truly began. That last fact is crucial, because in September 1874, Colonel Ranald Mackenzie did not defeat the Comanche by proving that his soldiers could survive the plains better than they could. He attacked the 6 layers themselves, burning the shelters, destroying the food, and capturing the horses that made recovery possible. By the end of this story, a battle with relatively few direct casualties will become one of the most devastating victories of the Red River War. But to understand why, we first have to step onto the Llano Estacado on the night the temperature suddenly drops. Part 1. The cold that arrived without warning. Winter on the southern Great Plains does not always announce itself slowly. A day can begin mild enough for shirt sleeves. Then the wind turns north. The sky darkens, the temperature collapses, and dry cold pours over the prairie. These outbreaks, often called northers, can transform comfortable weather into dangerous exposure within hours. On a flat plateau such as the Llano Estacado, the wind has little to stop it. A person standing in the open loses heat not only to the cold air, but also to convection, as moving air constantly strips away the thin layer of warmth near the skin. Sweat or damp clothing makes the problem worse. So does exhaustion. Hunger reduces the fuel available to maintain body temperature. Contact with frozen ground draws away heat from below. That last danger is easy to underestimate. A blanket placed only over the body cannot prevent the earth from absorbing warmth. Modern campers solve the problem with insulated sleeping pads. Plains people solved it with natural materials arranged in layers. American soldiers campaigning in the region often carried manufactured equipment, but equipment designed elsewhere was not always suited to this landscape. Supply wagons could fall behind. Canvas tents could be damaged by wind. Fuel might be scarce. Uniforms appropriate for 1 week could be dangerously inadequate the next. Military discipline could organize a column, but it could not replace intimate knowledge of terrain. Comanche survival began before anyone lay down to sleep. It began with reading the country, and the first decision was so effective that it could make an entire storm feel weaker without producing a single flame. Part 2. The first wall was the land itself. The simplest way to survive a powerful winter wind is not to fight it. It is to move out of it. During cold seasons, Comanche bands could seek protected locations in river valleys, breaks, and canyons cut below the exposed plains. Palo Duro Canyon in the Texas Panhandle became one of the most famous of these refuges. Its walls descend hundreds of feet beneath the surrounding plateau. Along the canyon floor were water, brush, cottonwood, and other sources of fuel and shelter. Farther south and west, other canyon systems offered similar advantages. Blanco Canyon, Tule Canyon, and networks of draws and side ravines created pockets of protection that were almost invisible to someone traveling only across the high ground. The difference could be dramatic. Above the rim, wind might travel uninterrupted across the plateau. Below it, rock walls reduced wind speed. Sunlight warmed protected surfaces, and vegetation grew near water. A few degrees of temperature mattered, but reduced wind mattered even more. Lower wind meant slower heat loss, steadier fires, less strain on shelters, and calmer animals. Choosing a campsite required more than finding the deepest hollow. A camp needed reliable water. It needed fuel close enough to gather without wasting energy. It needed ground that would not flood if weather changed. It needed access routes for people and horse herds. It also needed defensible approaches, because winter shelter was worthless if an enemy could enter unseen. Knowledge of these locations accumulated across generations. Trails that looked impossible from the rim might lead safely down. A side canyon that trapped an unfamiliar rider could provide a hidden route for someone who understood it. Landmarks, springs, seasonal grazing areas, and escape paths formed a mental map more useful than any single piece of equipment. When soldiers entered this country, they frequently struggled with terrain the Comanche used as infrastructure. A canyon was not merely a scenic formation. It was a windbreak, water source, storehouse, defensive position, and winter home. This was the first protective layer. Do not build your shelter where the weather is strongest. But a canyon could only weaken the wind. It could not keep smoke out of your lungs, stop frozen earth from draining your heat, or create warmth after midnight. For that, the Comanche needed a house that could be carried away on horseback and rebuilt before darkness. Part 3. A portable house built for movement. Once a sheltered location had been chosen, the tipi created the next layer. Calling it a primitive tent misses nearly everything important about it. A tipi was a portable dwelling shaped by long experience on the plains. Its conical frame distributed wind loads efficiently. Its sloping sides shed rain. Properly pitched and maintained, it remained stable in weather that could flatten poorly placed canvas. Comanche lodges were commonly constructed around a four-pole foundation, with additional poles arranged to complete the frame. The exact number and size varied with the lodge, available materials, and period. Long, straight poles were valuable because suitable timber was not equally available everywhere. The poles were therefore transported and reused. Before horses transformed plains mobility, moving a large hide lodge demanded enormous labor. With horses, tipi poles could become the shafts of a travois. Household goods were secured on the frame and dragged to the next camp. On arrival, the same poles became the skeleton of the home. This was engineering shaped by mobility, one object performing more than one job. The outer covering was traditionally made from prepared bison hides sewn together, although canvas became increasingly common through trade during the 19th century. Hide and canvas behaved differently, but both could be shaped around the conical frame. The entrance was generally oriented with attention to prevailing wind and camp arrangement. At the top of the lodge, smoke flaps could be adjusted according to wind direction. This allowed a small central fire to burn while smoke escaped above. The system was not perfect, and anyone who has lived around an open fire knows that smoke can shift unpredictably. But compared with a sealed structure, the tipi offered a practical balance between ventilation and heat. Air entered low, fed the fire, warmed, and rose. The shape of the lodge encouraged that upward movement. By changing the smoke flaps and controlling the opening, occupants could respond to changing wind. Then came one of the most important components, the liner. An inner wall of hide, cloth, or another material could be suspended around the lower interior. The gap between liner and outer cover reduced direct drafts and encouraged incoming air to move upward rather than sweeping immediately across people at floor level. The trapped or slowly moving air also added insulation. The principle is familiar today. Insulation works largely by slowing the movement of heat, often through layers that hold relatively still air. A modern double-wall tent uses a related idea. So does layered clothing. So do insulated windows. Additional dry grass, mats, hides, and robes could further reduce drafts. But ventilation still mattered. A lodge with an interior fire could never be treated like a sealed box. Safe warmth depended on airflow, fire size, wind direction, and constant practical judgment. The lodge, therefore, did not eliminate winter. It created a smaller climate that people could manage. And here is the detail most popular stories leave out. The mounted warriors whose speed terrified armies were not the people who owned this architecture. The survival of the camp depended on another group whose expertise military reports often pushed into the background. Part 4. The women who owned the architecture. The technical knowledge behind this shelter belonged primarily to Comanche women. Women made, owned, erected, maintained, and packed the tipis. They processed hides, repaired seams, evaluated poles, arranged interiors, managed household stores, and supervised much of the work that turned a campsite into a functioning community. That fact changes how we should picture Comanche survival. Popular images often place the mounted male warrior at the center of every story. His riding and fighting skills were extraordinary, but a war party could exist only because a much larger system supported it. The shelter waiting at the end of winter travel was the product of expertise that was taught, practiced, and inherited. Producing a large hide cover required planning. Bison hides had to be taken, cleaned, scraped, prepared, softened, fitted, and sewn. Damage from sparks, weather, transport, or repeated use had to be repaired. The lodge had to be adjusted to the season and to the needs of the household. A skilled woman did not merely follow a rigid diagram. She made decisions in response to actual conditions. How hard was the wind? Was the ground damp? How many people needed space? Was fuel abundant? Would the camp move again soon? Which possessions needed protection first? This knowledge rarely appears in military campaign reports because soldiers tended to record chiefs, battles, horse counts, and weapons. Yet the destruction of lodges and household supplies had such devastating power precisely because these objects embodied years of labor and generations of knowledge. When a lodge was burned, the loss was not just material. A home, workshop, storage space, social center, and survival tool disappeared at once. Yet even the best lodge contained a hidden danger. A sleeper could be protected from the wind and still lose dangerous amounts of heat through the one surface touching almost the entire body, the ground. Part 5. The battle against the frozen ground. Even a warm lodge cannot protect a sleeper who lies directly on frozen earth. The body continuously gives off heat. When it touches a cold surface, that heat flows downward. The heavier the body presses into its bedding, the more insulation can be compressed, reducing the amount of air trapped inside it. This is why the layer beneath a sleeper can matter as much as the covering above. Comanche bedding could include grass, mats, hides, blankets acquired through trade, and bison robes. Materials were arranged to separate the body from the ground while also trapping warmth around it. A bison robe was especially valuable in cold weather. The best winter robes came from animals carrying their thick seasonal coats. Their dense hair trapped air, slowing heat loss. It is safer to understand this as a property of the full coat, its density, texture, and depth, rather than as a magical quality of a single hair. Hides used for lodge covers and robes used for bedding did not always come from animals taken in the same season or receive identical treatment. A flexible robe needed to bend around the body. If poorly prepared, it could become stiff and unpleasant. If expertly worked, it remained useful through severe cold and repeated travel. Robes could be placed below the body and above it. Several people sleeping close together could reduce the surface area exposed to cold air. Clothing added another layer. Every layer held a little more warmed air and slowed the escape of heat. This was not the soft, elevated bed familiar in a modern home. But within the protected environment of a well-pitched lodge, a deep bed of dry insulating material could make rest possible even when the surrounding landscape froze. That rest had strategic importance. A person who merely survives a night but wakes exhausted, numb, and unable to ride is not truly prepared for the next day. Comanche mobility depended on people and animals recovering enough to travel, hunt, guard herds, care for children, and respond to threats at dawn. Comfort was therefore not a luxury. It was part of readiness. With the body insulated above and below, one problem remained. A fire could warm the lodge, but it could also consume scarce fuel, fill the shelter with smoke, throw sparks onto valuable hides, or die at the coldest hour. The solution was not a larger fire. It was a smarter one. Part 6. Fire without wasting fuel. Fire provided warmth, light, cooked food, dried materials, and social focus. But on the plains, fuel could not be taken for granted. Wood was available in many river bottoms and canyons, but open grassland might offer little. Plains peoples also used dried bison dung, often called buffalo chips. Once thoroughly dry, these chips could burn steadily and were available across areas where large herds had grazed. To someone unfamiliar with the plains, dung might appear to be refuse. To people who understood the environment, it was stored solar energy, grass eaten by bison, dried by wind and sun, then collected as fuel. An enormous fire was not necessarily the best fire inside a teepee. Too much flame consumed fuel quickly, increased sparks and smoke, and could make the upper lodge hot, while leaving conditions near the floor uneven. A smaller, controlled fire provided useful heat and could be maintained more efficiently. At bedtime, the goal was not always to keep tall flames burning until sunrise. Coals could be allowed to form, then protected so embers remained alive. Covering coals appropriately with ash slowed combustion and helped preserve heat. In the morning, the fire could be revived by exposing the embers, supplying dry tinder, and adding fuel. This saved time and energy at the coldest part of the day. Starting a new fire with stiff hands, damp tinder, and a strong wind is far harder than waking a live coal bed. Heated stones could also store warmth. Stones placed near or in a fire absorbed energy and released it gradually after being moved. Wrapped or positioned carefully to prevent burns and avoid damaging bedding. They could warm a sleeping area after flames had diminished. Not every stone is safe for intense heating. Some moisture-filled rocks can fracture or burst. Practical experience determined which materials worked and how they should be handled. This is another reminder that a technique that sounds simple may depend on detailed knowledge. Hot stones also had ceremonial and cleansing uses among many indigenous peoples, though those practices should not be reduced to a camping trick. In a sleeping context, the central idea was thermal storage. Capture heat while fuel is burning and release it slowly later. Modern campers use insulated bottles, chemical warmers, heated bricks, or hot water containers for the same reason. Fire produces heat quickly. A dense object can release some of that heat over a longer period. But every shelter, robe, ember, and heated stone was only slowing heat loss. None of them could keep a starving body warm for long. The next layer was carried not on the outside of the body, but inside it. Part 7. Warmth began with food shelter slows heat loss. It does not create the energy that keeps a human body alive. That energy comes from food. Comanche life centered heavily on the bison, though the full diet varied by season, place, trade, gathering, and opportunity. Meat could be eaten fresh, dried for later use, or combined with rendered fat in concentrated preserved foods often broadly described in English as pemmican. Different indigenous nations made different versions, and the word itself entered English through Cree usage. It should not be treated as a single universal recipe. But the underlying preservation strategy was powerful. Remove moisture from lean meat, pound or shred it, combine it with fat, and protect the mixture from spoilage. The result was compact food carrying substantial calories for its weight. That mattered to people traveling with limited storage and to communities preparing for periods when hunting became difficult. Fat was particularly important because it is energy-dense. Gram for gram, dietary fat provides more energy than protein or carbohydrate. In cold conditions, sufficient total calories help the body maintain temperature and support activity. Digestion itself also produces some heat, although the size of that effect varies by nutrient and should not be exaggerated. The larger point is simpler. A cold, active person who is underfed becomes vulnerable quickly. A meal rich in meat and fat before a winter night gave the body fuel that would be used over many hours. Marrow, organ meats, rendered fat, dried meat, gathered plant foods, and traded goods could all contribute to survival. Food stores also protected a camp from uncertainty. A blizzard might prevent hunting. Game might move. Horses might be exhausted. A prepared supply meant that one bad day did not immediately become a crisis. But preservation required labor. Meat had to be cut thin, dried without spoiling, protected from animals, packed, moved, and guarded. Fat had to be rendered. Containers had to be made or acquired. As with shelter, the finished product represented work performed long before the dangerous night arrived. This is the hidden structure of survival. Preparation done in good weather becomes warmth in bad weather. Food supplied the fuel, but another enemy could destroy the value of almost every layer at once. It did not have to be cold. It only had to be wet. Part 8. Clothing, moisture, and the value of dryness. Accounts of winter survival often focus on dramatic cold and overlook a quieter danger: moisture. Wet clothing conducts heat away from the skin and loses much of its insulating value. Sweat created by hard riding, lifting, or climbing could become dangerous once activity stopped. Snow melting on clothing could have the same effect. Traditional clothing varied over time and circumstance, but could include leggings, shirts, dresses, breechcloths, moccasins, robes, and other hide garments. Trade introduced wool blankets, cloth, coats, and manufactured items. People combined what was available rather than remaining frozen in a single historical costume. Layering allowed adjustment. A person working hard could loosen or remove an outer layer before becoming soaked with sweat, then add protection again when resting. Robes shielded the torso and trapped air. Moccasins offered mobility and could be supplemented with dry grass or other material for insulation, though they demanded attention in wet conditions. Drying near a fire had to be done carefully. Too close, and leather could be damaged or sparks could burn holes. Too far, and moisture remained. A household continually managed this balance, rotating garments, tending bedding, controlling smoke, and keeping essential items away from damp ground. The lodge itself needed similar care. Condensation, snow, rain, and ground moisture did not disappear because the structure was well designed. Warmth depended on daily maintenance. This is why survival was not something performed only by warriors. Children gathered fuel. Adults repaired equipment. Families watched weather and animals. Older people carried knowledge of places and past storms. The entire camp participated in keeping the system functional. Now 5 layers were working together: terrain, shelter, bedding, managed heat, and food. But they would remain tied to one location without the animal that transformed Comanche life, and that later became the most important target in Mackenzie's strategy. Part 9. Horses, Mobility, Wealth, and Survival. No discussion of Comanche life can avoid the horse. The ancestors of the Comanche moved south from the northern Rocky Mountain region, and access to horses helped transform their society during the late 17th and early 18th centuries. They became exceptional mounted hunters, traders, raiders, and warriors. Their influence expanded across the southern plains and into northern Mexico. Children learned to ride young. Skilled adults could maneuver at speed in ways that astonished observers. A rider could use the body of the horse for concealment, change direction rapidly, and coordinate with others across open country. The animal multiplied the distance a band could travel and the weight it could transport. That mobility supported winter survival. Horses carried people, robes, food, lodge covers, tools, and household goods. They pulled travois. They allowed bands to move toward bison, water, trade, or shelter before a seasonal crisis became fatal. Horses also created obligations. A large herd needed grass, water, protection, and constant supervision. Winter grazing could be difficult, especially after ice covered the ground. Animals had to be positioned where terrain and vegetation offered protection. Losing a herd meant losing far more than transportation. Some popular retellings claim that Comanche families routinely brought horses into their tipis for warmth. Such a broad claim is difficult to support and is probably exaggerated. People across cold regions have certainly sheltered close to animals or used shared structures in emergencies, and nearby horses could influence the microclimate of a protected camp. But a full-sized horse inside an ordinary family teepee would create serious problems of space, fire safety, and control. The stronger historical point does not require that image. Horses were essential to the survival system because they made the system mobile. They allowed a community to carry shelter, bedding, food, and tools to the location where those resources would work best. And that is why horse herds would later become a primary military target. Before we reach the attack, put every layer together and follow one family through a single freezing night. Only then does the full design become visible. Part 10. A night inside the system. Now bring all the layers together. Late in the afternoon, the wind begins to change. People in camp notice before the temperature falls. Smoke behaves differently. Horses turn away from the north. The sky takes on the hard color that precedes a cold front. The camp is already below the canyon rim, but preparations accelerate. Lodges are checked. Lines and covers are tightened. Smoke flaps are adjusted. Fuel is carried close and protected. Water is collected before ice forms. Horses are moved to sheltered grazing and watched carefully. Inside one lodge, bedding is lifted and examined for dampness. Dry grass and hides create a barrier against the ground. Robes are arranged above. Clothing is aired near the fire. Food that was prepared months earlier is ready without requiring a long hunt. The evening meal does more than satisfy hunger. It replaces the energy spent during the day and provides fuel for the night. The fire cooks, gives light, and warms the interior. Heated stones store part of that energy. As darkness deepens, the cold front arrives. Above the canyon, wind tears across the plateau. Below, the rock walls break its force. What remains strikes the conical lodge and moves around it. Some cold air enters low, but the liner helps direct it upward. The fire draws oxygen and sends smoke toward the opening. People settle into beds insulated from the earth. Robes trap warmth. Family members sleep near one another. The fire diminishes to coals. Stored heat from the stones spreads through the bedding. No single layer is miraculous. The canyon alone would still be cold. The tipi alone would still lose heat. Robes placed directly on frozen, wet ground would be less effective. A fire without ventilation would be dangerous. Food without shelter would not stop the wind. Together, however, the layers change the odds. The goal is not to make the lodge feel like a modern heated room. The goal is to keep bodies dry, fed, shielded from wind, separated from the ground, and surrounded by enough retained warmth to sleep and recover. At first light, someone uncovers the coals. Dry fuel catches. The lodge brightens. Food and water are warmed. Outside, the air may still be bitter, but the community is awake and functioning. That is the achievement. Not dramatic suffering, but ordinary life continuing through extraordinary weather. To an outsider, none of this necessarily looked like advanced technology. That misunderstanding would shape the war that followed. Part 11. Why outsiders misunderstood IT. Many 19th century observers praised indigenous toughness while failing to understand indigenous technology. Calling people naturally hardy allowed outsiders to ignore the knowledge behind their success. If Comanche people survived because they were simply tougher, then there was nothing to learn from campsite selection, shelter design, food preservation, hide preparation, horse management, or seasonal movement. This misunderstanding was reinforced by a narrow definition of technology. A manufactured iron stove looked advanced. A hide lodge looked primitive. Yet the meaningful question is not which object appears more industrial. It is which system performs the required job under real conditions. A stove without fuel is useless. A heavy building that cannot move may become a trap when water and grazing disappear. A uniform produced in a factory offers little protection if it is wet or designed for another climate. Comanche technology was adapted to a mobile life in a variable environment. It prioritized repairability, portability, local materials, and knowledge carried by people. It could not be separated from social organization. A tipi worked because someone knew how to make, place, ventilate, and maintain it. Preserved food worked because people understood hunting seasons, processing, storage, and distribution. The apparent simplicity of the objects concealed the complexity of the system. American military officers eventually came to understand at least part of that truth. They learned that defeating mounted bands in open combat was extremely difficult. Comanche groups could disperse, move rapidly, choose when to fight, and vanish into country they knew better than their pursuers. So military strategy shifted. Instead of trying only to defeat warriors in battle, campaigns increasingly targeted the material foundations that allowed communities to remain independent. And in 1874, one hidden winter refuge placed almost every layer of that system within reach of a single cavalry command. Part 12. The road to Palo Duro. By the early 1870s, the southern plains were under enormous pressure. Treaties had attempted to confine indigenous nations to reservations, but many Comanche, Kiowa, Southern Cheyenne, and Arapaho people continued to hunt and live beyond reservation boundaries. The destruction of bison herds accelerated. Commercial hunters killed animals on a scale that threatened both ecology and indigenous independence. Conflict intensified after the attack on buffalo hunters at Adobe Walls in June 1874. The United States launched the Red River War, sending multiple military columns into the region. The objective was not simply to win one decisive battlefield encounter. It was to keep pressure on the bands, deny them rest, destroy supplies, seize horses, and force them onto reservations. Colonel Ranald S. Mackenzie and the 4th Cavalry were central to this campaign. Mackenzie had years of experience pursuing Comanche groups through difficult terrain. He had learned that a temporary tactical victory meant little if the bands retained horses, food, and access to refuge. In September 1874, scouts guided Mackenzie's command toward Palo Duro Canyon. On the canyon floor were camps belonging to several native groups, along with lodges, winter provisions, equipment, and a large horse herd. The location had everything that made it valuable: water, grazing, fuel, shelter from wind, and terrain that discouraged attack. The very qualities that protected the camps also concentrated their essential resources in one place. Mackenzie's force reached the canyon rim before dawn on September 28th. A narrow route allowed soldiers to descend. Surprise was critical. A slow, obvious approach would give the camps time to scatter with horses and supplies. As daylight arrived, the attack began. What happened next is often described as a battle. But the brief exchange of gunfire was not the action that decided the future of the people in the canyon. The decisive blow began after most of them had escaped. Part 13. A battle aimed at winter. The people in the canyon resisted and escaped through difficult terrain, but the engagement produced fewer battlefield deaths than its later reputation might suggest. The decisive violence came after the camps were abandoned. Soldiers destroyed lodges, food, equipment, and accumulated supplies. These were not incidental objects left behind after a battle. They were the physical layers of the winter survival system. Consider what each loss meant. A burned tipi meant no portable wind-resistant home. A destroyed robe meant less insulation above and below a sleeping body. Ruined dried meat and stored fat meant fewer calories during cold weather. Lost tools meant less ability to repair, process hides, prepare food, or rebuild. Scattered families had to replace all of this while moving through a landscape where bison were becoming scarcer and military columns remained active. Then came the horse herd. Mackenzie's troops captured roughly 1,400 horses, though historical counts vary. The command kept a limited number and ordered most of the rest shot. The killing took place away from the main camp area, but the effect was unmistakable. The horses represented transportation, hunting power, military mobility, trade wealth, family property, and the ability to move heavy shelter and supplies. Without them, every remaining piece of the survival system became harder to use. The destruction at Palo Duro was therefore not merely punishment after combat. It was logistical warfare. The objective was to make continued independent life on the plains impossible as winter approached. This distinction matters. The United States did not overcome Comanche winter knowledge by building a better teepee or becoming more skilled at living from the land. It used concentrated military force to destroy the resources that allowed the knowledge to function. People escaping the canyon still knew how to select a campsite, prepare a robe, manage a fire, preserve meat, and care for horses. But knowledge cannot instantly replace a slaughtered herd or months of stored food. In the weeks following the campaign, increasing numbers of people returned to reservation agencies. Resistance did not end in a single moment, but the Red River War had entered its final phase. By 1875, the remaining holdouts, including the group led by Quanah Parker, came into Fort Sill. The Army could call this a strategic success, but viewed from the canyon floor, victory meant something very different. Part 14. The cost of calling destruction victory. Military reports could describe the campaign as successful. From the Army's perspective, organized resistance had been broken and reservation confinement enforced. But words such as victory hide what happened to families. The camps included children, older people, food stores, clothing, bedding, homes, tools, and animals accumulated through years of work. Destroying them imposed hunger, exposure, grief, and dependence on people who had not chosen reservation life. The horse slaughter carried a cultural and emotional cost beyond its strategic purpose. Comanche people did not regard horses as interchangeable machines. Individual animals had training, history, value, and relationships with riders. A war horse, racehorse, hunting horse, or breeding animal could embody years of attention. The bison slaughter magnified the catastrophe. Commercial hunting, encouraged or tolerated by policies that recognized its strategic impact, removed the foundation of plains economies. With the herds collapsing, replacing robes and food stores became increasingly difficult even for people who still possessed weapons and horses. This is why the story cannot be reduced to clever winter camping advice followed by a dramatic battle. The survival system existed inside a sovereign way of life. Its destruction was part of a broader campaign of dispossession. At the same time, portraying Comanche people only as victims would be another distortion. The Comanche nation survived. Families preserved identity, memory, kinship, language, ceremony, and historical knowledge despite military defeat, reservation hardship, allotment, and assimilation policies. Today, the Comanche Nation is headquartered near Lawton, Oklahoma. The descendants of the people who lived across Comancheria are not figures who vanished into the 19th century. They are a living nation. Part 15. What the six-layer system really teaches. If we reduce the winter system to its central principles, 6 layers become visible. The first was terrain. Choose a place where the landscape reduces exposure. A canyon, draw, river bottom, or protected slope can do more than an extra blanket placed in the middle of open wind. The second was shelter. Use a structure shaped for local weather. Control airflow. Vent smoke. Reduce drafts. Create an interior environment that can be adjusted rather than sealed blindly. The third was ground insulation and bedding. Stop heat from escaping downward. Keep materials dry. Layer what lies beneath the body as carefully as what lies above it. The fourth was managed heat. Use fuel efficiently. Maintain coals. Store warmth in appropriate heated stones. Avoid depending on one large fire that consumes supplies and may fail before dawn. The fifth was nutrition. Enter the night fed. Preserve energy-dense food before it is needed. Recognize that shelter cannot compensate forever for a body running out of fuel. The sixth was mobility and community. Horses allowed the entire system to move. Shared labor allowed it to function. Knowledge distributed across families made it resilient. These layers overlapped. If wind entered the lodge, robes and bedding still slowed heat loss. If firewood was scarce, stored food helped the body generate warmth. If weather made one campsite dangerous, horses made relocation possible. Redundancy prevented a single failure from becoming fatal. Modern outdoor systems use exactly this logic. A winter camper carries a wind-resistant tent, insulated pad, sleeping bag, layered clothing, calorie-dense food, stove, and emergency backup. None is expected to solve every problem. Each supports the others. The similarity does not mean modern gear is copied directly from one indigenous design. It means experienced people confronting the same physical dangers often discover related principles. But when those principles were refined by indigenous nations, their origins deserve acknowledgement. Part 16. What we should not romanticize. It is tempting to hear this story and imagine that Comanche people were always warm, comfortable, and perfectly protected. They were not. Winter remained dangerous. Storms could overwhelm good planning. Illness, injury, hunger, wet bedding, lost horses, and scarce fuel could turn a cold night into an emergency. Infants and older people were especially vulnerable. No traditional technology made human beings invincible, nor should every practice reported by later writers be accepted without question. 19th century observers misunderstood what they saw, repeated rumors, generalized from one community to another, and sometimes reshaped stories for readers eager for exotic images. Claims that heated stones always lasted until morning, that every lodge was exceptionally warm, or that horses routinely slept inside family tipis should be treated cautiously. Practices differed between bands, households, seasons, and decades. Trade changed available materials. Warfare disrupted traditions. Reservation life altered them again. The story becomes more impressive, not less, when exaggeration is removed. Comanche people did not need supernatural resistance to cold. They used disciplined observation, accumulated knowledge, skilled labor, adaptable materials, and coordinated community action. Their success came from understanding limits. They knew the wind could not be defeated by pride. They knew a hungry body would cool. They knew the ground could steal heat. They knew a fire needed air. They knew possessions had to be portable because the next source of water, grass, game, or safety might be many miles away. That is intelligence applied to survival. Part 17. The night after Palo Duro returned now to the canyon in late September 1874. Smoke rises from the remains of lodges and supplies. The cries and gunfire around the captured horse herd have ended. Families who escaped carry what they could, but much of the winter's preparation is gone. The weather is not yet at its worst. That is exactly why the attack is so effective. There is time before deep winter, but not enough time to rebuild everything under military pressure and ecological collapse. A person may still know how to make a warm bed, but knowledge does not become a robe without a bison hide and days of labor. A family may know how to move to a sheltered canyon, but movement is slower without horses. Hunters may know where to seek game, but commercial slaughter has reduced the herds. A coal can preserve fire overnight, but it cannot replace a warehouse of burned food. The 6 layers have been separated from one another. This is why Palo Duro mattered beyond the number of casualties. Mackenzie struck the network that converted knowledge into independence. He did not have to kill every warrior. He had to make the coming winter impossible to face on Comanche terms. The event reveals the power of the survival system through the scale of effort used to dismantle it. The soldiers could destroy objects in a morning. They could not burn the knowledge contained in the people who escaped. Part 18. The knowledge that outlived the campaign. The physical resources destroyed at Palo Duro could burn in hours. Knowledge did not disappear so easily. Techniques of hide preparation, shelter construction, food processing, horse care, route finding, weather reading, and camp organization survived in families and communities. Some practices continued. Others were interrupted, transformed, or later revived. Museums and historical sites now display tipis, robes, tools, photographs, and campaign artifacts. These can help people learn, but objects behind glass are incomplete. A tipi pole without the knowledge of how to select and pitch it is only a pole. A robe without the history of who prepared and used it becomes decoration. The deeper technology lived in relationships between people and land, women and household production, riders and horses, hunters and bison, elders and younger generations. That is also why responsible history should listen to Comanche voices, not only military reports. Army records can tell us where a column marched, how many horses officers claimed to have captured, and what property soldiers destroyed. Comanche oral histories and community knowledge reveal what those losses meant. Both types of sources must be examined critically. Together, they produce a fuller account than either can provide alone. Conclusion. So, how did Comanche warriors sleep through freezing nights outdoors? They usually did not sleep alone on an exposed plain with nothing but toughness between them and the cold. They slept within a system. The land formed the first shelter. Canyon walls and protected valleys weakened the wind. The tipi formed the second. Its conical structure, adjustable smoke flaps, controlled airflow, and inner liner created a manageable interior. The bed formed the third. Dry grass, mats, hides, blankets, and thick winter robes separated the body from frozen ground and trapped warmth above it. The fire formed the fourth. Small flames, preserved coals, carefully chosen fuel, and stored heat stretched limited energy through the night. Food formed the fifth. Meat, fat, marrow, dried provisions, and other foods gave the body enough energy to maintain itself through cold and activity. Mobility and community formed the sixth. Horses transported the lodge and its supplies. Skilled labor maintained them. Shared knowledge connected every part. There was no single invention that made the Comanche immune to winter. Their strength came from integration. Every choice reduced one danger and supported another choice. And that leads to the final lesson. Survival is often portrayed as an individual contest. One person against the wilderness, armed with courage and a knife. The Comanche example tells a different story. Survival was collective. It depended on knowledge inherited from people who had already made mistakes, endured storms, tested materials, watched animals, and remembered which canyon remained protected when the north wind arrived. It depended on work performed months before anyone felt cold. It depended on respecting the limits of the human body instead of pretending those limits did not exist. In 1874, the United States Army recognized how difficult it was to overcome people supported by such a system. Its response at Palo Duro was to destroy